All right, so you're interested in Scrum testing. Huh. You've come to the right place.
Yeah, it's a hot topic these days.
For sure. Lots of folks trying to wrap their heads around how testing fits into this whole uh, agile, Scrum thing.
It can be a bit of a puzzle at first.
Totally. Like, are you prepping for a new project, new job, or just kind of curious?
Whatever the reason, we're going to unpack it all today.
Yeah, we're diving deep. Using this beginner's guide we found on Scrum testing. It's really cool. And I got to say, one thing that really jumped out at me,
What's that?
well, it's this idea that a pure Scrum team, like a real by-the-book Scrum team,
Right, right.
they don't actually have a tester role. Isn't that wild?
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised to hear that.
I know. When I first learned about Scrum, I pictured like developers just sprinting around,
Yeah.
coding and testing at the same time. It seemed kind of chaotic.
Well, it's not quite that chaotic.
Okay, good.
Think of it more like everyone understands that quality is super important and
Yeah.
everyone chips in to make it happen.
So everyone's a tester then.
In a way, yeah. Developers, for example, they're often the first line of defense, making sure their code works the way it should.
Gotcha. But okay, what about really complex projects? I mean, you need some serious testing expertise for those, right? You can't just have everyone winging it.
You're absolutely right. Depending on the project, you might still have a dedicated testing team.
Okay, that makes more sense.
It's all about, finding the right balance, adapting the approach to fit the situation.
Flexibility is key. Now, speaking of adapting, our guide mentions these three pillars of Scrum: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. I'm guessing these tie into testing somehow.
Big time. These pillars are like the foundation of Scrum, right?
Oh,
Transparency means everyone knows what's going on, right? No secrets. Inspection means we're constantly checking the work, looking for ways to improve. And adaptation, well, that's where we actually use that feedback to tweak things and keep everything moving in the right direction.
it's like this constant cycle of checking and adjusting.
Exactly. Let's say a tester spots a bug that keeps popping up, right? During the inspection phase, they raise it in the daily scrum, and then the team adapts. They change how they're coding to prevent that bug from happening again. That's scrum testing in a nutshell.
I love that. A real-world example. It really clicks.
Mhm.
Okay, so those pillars are super active throughout the whole testing process.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then, there's this other key thing about Scrum. It's iterative. It uses these short, fixed-length cycles called sprints, where the team focuses on delivering a specific set of features. It's like mini projects within a bigger project.
Like those checkpoints in a marathon,
Yeah.
breaking down the work into manageable chunks. Okay, that makes sense. But what about like those huge GE projects that span multiple sprints? How does Scrum handle those?
Good question. That's where release cycles come in. Basically, you group several sprints together to create, a usable chunk of the product that can be released to the world.
So release cycles are like those big milestones along the marathon route. I like it. And I'm guessing there's a very clear definition of what done means at each of those milestones, right? You don't want any ambiguity there.
You got it. That's where the definition of done comes in. It's like everyone needs to agree on what perfectly baked means, so you don't end up with a half-cooked cake.
Love that analogy. So we've got sprints for those bursts of work, release cycles for the big picture, and a shared understanding of what done actually looks like. But who are the key players in this Scrum game? Who are the, MVPs?
Well, the source breaks it down into three main roles. You've got the product owner, the scrum master, and the development team. Picture it like a triangle, each with their own unique responsibilities.
Okay, a triangle, I like it.
Yeah.
Let's start with the product owner. What do they do?
The product owner is the voice of the customer. They make sure the team is building the right thing, the thing that will actually deliver value. They define features, prioritize them based on market value, profitability, all that, and they have the final say on whether the work is truly done.
Sounds like a big job. Like they're steering the ship, making sure everyone's rowing in the right direction.
Exactly. Now, the scrum master, they're a different breed. They're the facilitator. They make sure the team follows those scrum principles and they clear any roadblocks that pop up along the way.
Mhm.
Think of them as a coach, guiding the team towards self-organization and constant improvement.
So if the product owner is the captain, the Scrum Master is the first mate.
Haha, yeah, something like that, keeping the ship running smoothly. And then, of course, you have the crew.
The development team.
Right, they're the ones actually building the software. And in Scrum, it's a cross-functional group, usually 5 to 9 people. Developers, designers, testers, everyone needed to bring the product to life.
A real team effort. It's really starting to click for me how testers fit into all this, even without that formal role. But before we get into that, let's talk about the tools and processes that make Scrum tick.
Good point. Our source highlights 5 key artifacts. They're like tools that help Scrum teams stay organized and on track.
Tools, I'm all ears.
We've got the product backlog, the sprint backlog, the release backlog, the burn down chart, and the block list. Don't worry, we'll break these down.
Perfect. Jargon-free zone here, please.
Deal. Okay, so first, the product backlog. Think of it as like the master to-do list for the entire project. All the features, all the user stories, everything the product needs, all prioritized based on value and dependencies.
So it's the ultimate roadmap, right?
Exactly. Now, for each sprint, the team picks a set of items from the product backlog to focus on. That becomes the sprint backlog, the mini to-do list for that specific sprint.
Gotcha. So we've got the master plan and then the short-term plan. What about all the stuff that's already done?
That goes into the release backlog. As the team completes sprints, they build up this collection of finished features that could potentially be released as like a working piece of the product.
Okay, so it's like those progress reports showing how far you've come. Makes sense. Now, what about the burn down chart and the block list? What are those all about?
These are super important for keeping things moving and spotting any issues. The burn down chart, it's a visual representation of the work left in a sprint. It's updated daily, so it helps you track progress and see if there are any potential delays. It's like a fuel gauge for your sprint.
Ooh, I like that. So you can see how much you have left in the tank. What about the block list? What goes on there?
Anything that gets in the team's way, a technical issue, a dependency on another team, literally anything that stops progress.
So it's like a troubleshooting log.
Exactly. That way, the Scrum Master can step in and help clear those obstacles, like a superhero swooping in to save the day.
Uh-huh. I love it. Okay, so these 5 artifacts, they all work together to create this really transparent, organized system for managing the work in Scrum.
Yeah, it's all about keeping everyone in the loop. Everyone knows what needs to be done, how things are progressing, and what needs fixing.
It's like a well-oiled machine, huh? All the parts working in sync.
Ah.
All right, so we've covered the pillars of Scrum, the roles, and the essential tools. Now let's talk about those ceremonies. What are those all about?
Yes, the Scrum ceremonies. These specific meetings, they're all about fostering collaboration, communication, and, that continuous improvement we keep talking about.
So it's not just about coding all the time.
Not at all. It's about those regular check-ins, those feedback loops, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through these ceremonies. What are they like?
Well, first up, we have sprint planning. This is where the team gets together at the start of each sprint to select user stories from the product backlog and build out that sprint backlog for the sprint.
So it's like a collaborative brainstorming session to kick things off.
Exactly. And get this, even without a formal role, testers are key players here. They estimate how much effort will be needed for testing each user story, and they help figure out the priority order for tackling those stories.
So they're involved right from the get-go, making sure testing is considered from the very beginning. That's cool.
Absolutely. Now, another essential ceremony is the daily scrum. This is that famous 15-minute stand-up meeting where the team syncs up on their progress, identifies any roadblocks, and plans for the day ahead.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. They sound like a super efficient way to stay connected.
They are. Everyone literally stands up to keep it short and sweet, and it really forces that open communication.
I like that. So you've got the planning at the start and those daily check-ins. What happens at the end of a sprint? Is there like a big finale?
You bet. At the end of each sprint, there's a sprint review. This is where the team demonstrates the working product increment to the stakeholders. They get feedback, and they talk about potential improvements for the next sprint.
So it's like a show and tell, but with real input from the folks who will be using the software.
Exactly. And for testers, this is a great chance to shine because they get to show how they've been ensuring quality throughout the sprint.
That makes sense. It's about showing the value of all those testing efforts. But what about continuous improvement? How does that fit into the Scrum picture?
That's where the sprint retrospective comes in. This is dedicated time for the team to reflect on the sprint, talk about what went well, what could be better, and come up with action steps for the next sprint.
So it's a lessons learned session, focus on growing and making things better each time.
You nailed it. These 4 ceremonies, they create this rhythm within Scrum. They make sure there's regular communication, collaboration, and adaptation. It's a beautiful thing.
I'm really starting to see how dynamic Scrum really is. It's not just about churning out code. It's about constant feedback, working as a team, and making sure the product is top-notch. Speaking of teamwork, I think it's time we circle back to our main focus testing, We've touched on it throughout our conversation, but I think our listeners are ready for a closer look at how testers fit into this framework, even without that formal title.
I agree. Let's dive deeper.
All right, so we're back and ready to unpack this whole tester's role thing in Scrum. Before we took a break, we were talking about how testing is everyone's responsibility, which I have to admit is still kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of thinking about things.
For sure.
But when you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, okay.
In a fast-paced environment like Scrum, you need everyone on board with quality right from the get-go. You can't just, like, tack it on at the end.
Right. It's not about finding bugs after the fact. It's about preventing them in the first place. But how does this shared responsibility thing actually work? Does everyone just start, like, randomly testing things?
Not quite. While everyone contributes to quality, testers play a really important role in guiding and facilitating the whole process. Think of them as, like, quality coaches.
Okay.
They make sure everyone understands the goals, the methods, and what done actually means when it comes to testing.
So they're like the quality quarterbacks, calling the plays and making sure everyone's on the same page.
I like that analogy.
Uh-huh.
They're proactive communicators, you know. They're sharing their insights, flagging potential issues early on, and working closely with developers to find solutions.
So it's a very collaborative role. It's not just someone sitting in a corner writing test cases all day.
Yeah.
And speaking of collaboration, all those Scrum ceremonies we talked about before the break, those seem like the perfect opportunities for testers to really shine.
Absolutely. Daily scrums, sprint reviews, sprint retrospectives, these are all golden opportunities for testers to communicate their findings, get feedback from the team, and contribute to that continuous improvement loop that's so vital in Scrum.
You know, I've worked on projects in the past where testing felt like such an afterthought, like it was a separate phase tacked on at the very end.
Right.
But what you're describing is so different. It's like testing is woven into the very fabric of the development process.
Exactly. It's not a static, isolated activity. It's an ongoing conversation, a collaborative dance between testers, developers, and the whole Scrum team.
This is really making me rethink how I view testing. It's way more dynamic and engaging than I ever realized. But I gotta ask, does this whole team-oriented approach diminish the need for specialized testing skills?
Not at all. Scrum encourages a collaborative approach, sure, but it absolutely does not downplay the importance of specialized testing knowledge. You still need people who deeply understand different testing techniques, who can design effective test cases, and who know how to use the right tools for the job.
So it's not about everyone becoming a testing expert overnight.
Right.
It's about bringing those specialized skills to the table and integrating them into this more collaborative framework.
Exactly. Scrum is all about leveraging everyone's strength and fostering that shared commitment to quality.
It's like a symphony orchestra, with everyone playing their part to create something beautiful.
Oh.
But let's get real for a second. Our source material mentioned that sometimes dedicated testing teams are still necessary, especially for more complex projects.
You're right. As much as Scrum aims to empower the whole team, there are definitely situations where having a dedicated testing team makes a lot of sense. Think about a project with tons of integrations or different platforms or maybe strict regulatory requirements.
Yeah.
That's where having a separate team with specialized skills and experience becomes really crucial.
So it's about recognizing when you need to bring in, like, the big guns
Exactly.
and adapting the Scrum framework to fit the specific needs of the project.
Precisely. It's about being flexible and making sure that testing is comprehensive and effective, no matter how complex the project is.
This really highlights how Scrum isn't just a rigid set of rules. It's more like a flexible blueprint that can be tailored to different contexts. It's about finding the right balance between agility and thoroughness.
Well said. And that flexibility, it extends to the types of testing that happen within Scrum too. Did you know that techniques like test-driven development, TDD, and behavior-driven development, BDD, fit really well within the Scrum framework?
Wait, TDD and BDD? Those sound familiar, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick refresher?
Sure. TDD, it basically flips the script on how we write code.
Okay.
Instead of writing the code first and then testing it, you write the tests first. That way, the code is designed to pass those tests from the very beginning. It's like having a safety net that catches errors early on.
Interesting. So it's like building a house, starting with the blueprint.
Exactly.
Making sure everything is structurally sound from the foundation up.
Now, BDD takes it a step further. It focuses on defining the desired behavior of the software from the user's perspective. You write scenarios that describe how the software should work in different situations, and then those scenarios actually become your tests.
So instead of just testing whether the code works, you're testing whether it actually meets the user's expectations, whether it delivers the value that it's supposed to.
Right.
That's really cool.
It is. Both TDD and BDD are great examples of how testing can be proactively integrated into the development process. They make sure that quality is built in from the very beginning.
This is really eye-opening. It's so different from that traditional test at the end approach. But I have to admit, I'm still a little curious about how those dedicated testing teams we talked about earlier actually integrate into a Scrum environment. If they're not part of the core development team, how do they stay in the loop? How does that all work?
That's a great question. It all comes down to communication and collaboration.
Okay.
Even if you have dedicated testing teams, they need to be tightly integrated into the Scrum process.
Gotcha.
They should be participating in sprint planning, daily scrums, all the other ceremonies. It's about breaking down those silos and making sure everyone is working towards the same goal.
So it's like having those specialized testing teams act as consultants or advisors,
Yeah, something like that.
working alongside the development team to make sure quality is maintained across the board.
Exactly. They bring their expertise to the table, but they're also learning from the development team and vice versa. It's a two-way street, which ultimately benefits the whole project.
This is so insightful. I'm really starting to see how Scrum really is a team sport and how testers, regardless of their formal role, are key players in that game.
Couldn't agree more. It's about using everyone's strengths, communicating effectively, and adapting to the constantly changing world of software development.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. But before we get too carried away, let's take a second to recap what we've learned so far and then dive into some final thoughts in the last part of our episode.
Sounds good to me. I'm looking forward to wrapping things up and leaving our listeners with some food for thought.
And we're back for the final part of our Scrum testing deep dive. Man, it's been a journey, huh? Exploring all the ins and outs of quality in this Agile world.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. From the basics, those core principles of Scrum, all the way to how testers make a real difference, even without, an official title.
One thing that really stuck with me is this idea that Scrum isn't just about speed, right? It's about building the right product. And that means quality is part of the deal from day one.
Absolutely. It's all about delivering real value to the customer, making sure the software actually meets their needs, not just hitting a deadline.
And we've seen how testers, even without that formal tester label, are essential to making that happen. They're involved in every step of the way.
Yep, from sprint planning, those early brainstorming sessions, to the daily scrums, all the way to the sprint reviews and retrospectives. They get to show what they've done to ensure quality.
It's like they're quality champions, constantly pushing for the best possible product, working alongside the developers to prevent those nasty bugs, rather than just trying to find them later on.
It's a much more proactive approach compared to those old waterfall methods.
Oh, yeah.
Testing was always an afterthought in those.
Right. Like tacked on at the end. Oh, yeah, we should probably test this now.
Exactly. But in Scrum, it's baked into the whole process.
And we saw how those Scrum ceremonies and artifacts, like the bane down charts and stuff, they create this system where everyone's on the same page.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Transparency, continuous improvement, that's the heart of it all. Those daily scrums, sprint reviews, retrospectives, they all keep the team connected and help them adapt and learn along the way. Always getting better, sprint after sprint.
So we've covered a lot, but before we wrap things up completely, something's been on my mind.
Go ahead.
We've talked about how flexible and adaptable Scrum is, but what about documentation? Especially for testing stuff. I mean, you need some documentation, right?
Sure. That's a really good point. It's something a lot of teams struggle with when they're transitioning to Agile. How do you stay agile without getting bogged down in paperwork, but also, keep enough documentation for compliance, for knowledge sharing?
Right, exactly. You don't want to lose those valuable insights.
Exactly. And there are ways to do it. There are strategies and tools out there that can help teams document their testing activities without, losing that agility that Scrum is all about.
That sounds like a whole other deep dive waiting to happen. But for now, I think we've reached the finish line of this one.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
So thanks to everyone for joining us on this exploration of Scrum testing. It's been a blast.
It really has. We hope you've learned some valuable things about how quality fits into this awesome Agile world. Until next time, folks, keep those sprints going strong and never stop testing.